Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something pretty wild, what hygiene was actually like during the Black Plague. And let me tell you, after hearing this story, you're going to be real grateful for modern plumbing and hand sanitizer. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. Alright, find that cozy spot, take a nice slow breath, and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to 14th century Europe. So congratulations, you just woke up in medieval Europe 1347. Your eyes blink open in the dim light of dawn, filtering through the cracks of your small wooden home. You're not lying on a soft mattress with Egyptian cotton sheets. Nope, you're on a straw-filled sack on the floor, sharing the warmth with your entire family. That musty smell filling your nostrils? Well, honestly, you can't remember the last time. The straw crunches as you shift positions. Itchy little bites pepper your skin. You scratch absently, used to the constant companionship of fleas and lice that call your bedding home. They're just part of life. Everyone has them, from the poorest peasant to the richest noble. These little biters don't discriminate, though the nobles might change their straw a bit more often than you can afford to. A rustling sound catches your attention. Rats. They're everywhere in medieval Europe, in the walls, under the floorboards, in the thatched roof above. They scurry through the streets, the fields, the storage bins where grain is kept. Nobody thinks much about them. They're just another fact of life, like the mud in the streets or the smoke from the cooking fires. You sit up, your back stiff from the hard floor. The rest of your family is still sleeping. Your spouse, your children, maybe your parents or in-laws too. Everyone piled together in one room, bodies providing warmth against the morning chill. Privacy isn't really a concept in 1347. Not for ordinary folks, anyway. Good news, you do actually wash your face and hands most mornings. Despite what people think about medieval hygiene, folks did try to stay reasonably clean when they could. Bad news, the water comes from the same well that everyone in the neighborhood uses, and it's questionable at best. You splash the cold water on your face from a wooden basin. No soap, though. Well, not like we think of soap today. Making soap is a whole complicated process involving ashes and animal fat, and most regular people don't bother with it daily. The rich might have fancy olive oil soaps, but you're not rich. You're just trying to get through another day without catching whatever illness is going around this season. And man, there's always something going around. Fevers, flux, consumption, sweating, sickness. Life is fragile. You've already buried at least a couple of children. Everyone has. It's just how things are. You step outside to relieve yourself. If you're lucky, your home has a designated area for this, maybe a bucket or a hole in the ground. If you're not so lucky, or if it's too cold to venture outside, there might be a chamber pot under the bed. Either way, the waste doesn't go far. It might be tossed into the street, or if you're a bit more considerate, carried to the nearest river or stream. Yeah, the same rivers and streams where people collect water and wash clothes. Sense a problem brewing? The streets aren't exactly what you'd call clean. In cities, they're narrow, muddy, and filled with, well, everything. Human waste, animal waste, food scraps. Whatever people don't want inside their homes ends up outside. The smell is something modern noses would find unbearable. But you're used to it. That's just what life smells like. In some of the more advanced cities, there might be laws against dumping waste in the streets, but they're rarely enforced. In many places, pigs roam freely, eating whatever garbage they find. It's a primitive waste disposal system, but it's what you've got. You make your way to the town well to draw water for the day. Women are gathered there, chatting, exchanging news and gossip. This is the medieval social media, face-to-face conversations where information, both reliable and not, spreads from person to person. "Did you hear about the strange illness in the southern port cities?" one woman whispers. "They say people are dying by the hundreds." "It's God's punishment," another replies firmly, "for the sins of the people. I heard it was the Jews poisoning the wells," a third adds, her voice dropping even lower. You listen, a slight chill running down your spine despite the morning sun warming your face. Rumours of illness aren't new, but something about the way they're talking, the fear in their voices, feels different. You push the thoughts away. There's work to be done, food to prepare, animals to tend, fields to work, depending on your station in life. Medieval life doesn't leave much time for worrying about things happening in distant cities. Back home, you break your fast with a chunk of dark bread and maybe some ale. Yes, ale, even for breakfast. Water isn't always trusted for drinking, but the brewing process makes ale safer. Even children drink it, though it's weaker than what adults consume. Your teeth? They're probably not in great shape. Dental hygiene consists of maybe rubbing them with a rough cloth or using a chewed stick as a makeshift toothbrush. Some people rinse with wine or vinegar to freshen their breath. The rich might use mixtures containing herbs or honey. Toothaches are common and devastating. There's not much to be done except perhaps pulling the offending tooth if it gets bad enough. As the day progresses, you go about your business. Maybe you're a craftsperson working leather or metal or wood. Maybe you're a farmer tending crops or animals. Maybe you're a merchant selling goods in the marketplace. Whatever your trade, it likely involves physical labor, dirt, and sweat. Speaking of sweat, contrary to popular belief, medieval people did bathe. Not daily, perhaps, but they didn't go their whole lives without washing either. How often you bathe depends on a few things: your social status, where you live, the time of year, and your access to water. If you're in a city, there might be public bathhouses where you can go to get clean. These are social places where people gather not just to bathe, but to socialize, eat, drink, and relax. Some are gender segregated, others aren't. Some have reputations for activities beyond just bathing, if you catch my drift. If you're wealthy, you might have a wooden tub that servants fill with heated water for your private bath. If you're of more modest means, bathing might be a communal affair in a larger tub or a quick wash in a river or stream during warmer months. But here's the thing. Bathing is becoming less common. There's a growing belief among physicians that water, especially hot water, opens the pores and makes the body vulnerable to illness. This idea will gain more traction in the coming years, especially after the events about to unfold. As you move through your day, you're surrounded by smells that would overwhelm a modern person. Body odor, yes, but also smoke from fires, animals and their waste, food, both fresh and rotting, tanning leather, dyeing cloth. All the processes of medieval life create a tapestry of odors that's just the backdrop of your existence. You don't notice it anymore. Some people carry small pomanders, balls of scented materials like herbs, flowers, or spices to hold near their noses when passing particularly foul-smelling areas. Others tuck fragrant herbs into their clothes. The wealthy might use perfumes made with exotic ingredients, but mostly people just live with the smells. As evening approaches, you might stop by the local tavern for some stronger ale and conversation. News travels slowly in the medieval world, but it does travel. Merchants, pilgrims, and other travellers bring stories from distant places, and the stories they're bringing now are troubling. There are whispers of a terrible disease sweeping through Mediterranean ports. They say it started somewhere in the east, maybe China or India, and travelled along the trade routes. They say it kills quickly and horribly. They say no one knows how to stop it. Some call it the Great Mortality. Later, people will call it the Black Death. You don't know it yet, sitting there with your ale, but you're about to experience one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. And all those hygiene practices we've been talking about, they're about to be put to the test. The year is 1347, and the plague has just arrived in Europe. In October of that year, 12 ships dock at the Sicilian port of Messina. They've come from the Black Sea carrying cargo and something else, something invisible and deadly. Most of the sailors aboard these ships are already dead or dying from a mysterious illness. The few still alive are covered in black boils, oozing blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities quickly order the ships out of the harbour, but it's too late. The Black Death has arrived in Europe. The disease spreads with terrifying speed. From Sicily, it moves to the mainland of Italy, then across the Mediterranean to North Africa. By 1348, it's in France, Spain, and Portugal. By 1349, it's reached England, Scotland, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, and parts of Eastern Europe. You didn't know about germs or bacteria or viruses. No one did. Microscopes won't be invented for centuries. The idea that tiny, invisible creatures could enter your body and make you sick would have seemed like fantasy. Instead, people had other explanations for disease. The most common was the theory of miasma, bad air. It was believed that disease spread through foul odours emanating from rotting organic matter. This wasn't entirely wrong. Areas with poor sanitation did tend to have more illness, but it missed the actual mechanism of transmission. Other theories were less scientific. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Some blamed particular groups, especially Jews, leading to horrific persecutions. Some thought it was caused by an unfavourable alignment of planets. Some believed it could be spread by sight, that just looking at a plague victim could infect you. In the absence of understanding, fear flourished, and there was plenty to fear. The symptoms of the plague were horrifying. The most common form was bubonic plague, characterized by painful swollen lymph nodes called buboes, particularly in the neck, armpit, and groin. These buboes could grow as large as an apple, turning black as they filled with blood and pus. Victims also suffered high fevers, vomiting, delirium, and bleeding under the skin that caused dark blotches. There was also pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs and could be spread directly from person to person through coughing and sneezing, and septicemic plague, where the bacteria infected the bloodstream. These forms were even deadlier than the already lethal bubonic form. Without antibiotics or modern medical care, the mortality rate was staggering. In some places, 80% of those infected died. Overall, it's estimated that the Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people, up to 60% of Europe's entire population. As the plague approaches your town, daily life begins to change. Fear grips communities. Some people flee to the countryside, hoping to escape infection. Others lock themselves in their homes, refusing to interact with anyone. Some turn to religion, participating in mass prayers and processions. Others abandon restraint entirely, figuring they might as well enjoy whatever time they have left. The authorities, such as they are, try to implement measures to control the spread. Some cities ban outsiders from entering. Others require quarantines for new arrivals. The word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. The length of time ships were required to remain isolated before passengers and crew could go ashore in some Italian cities. But none of it seems to work. The plague continues its inexorable spread, leaving death and devastation in its wake. And now it's reached your town. The first cases appear on the outskirts. A family living near the road that leads to the next town over. They'd hosted a travelling merchant a few days prior. Now they're all sick. Word spreads quickly. People are frightened. Some immediately blame the family. They must have sinned grievously for God to punish them so. Others quietly pack up their belongings, planning to leave before the disease can take hold. The local priest leads prayers for deliverance. The town's meagre medical practitioners, probably not university-trained physicians who are rare and expensive, but rather barber surgeons, herbalists, midwives, or others with some healing knowledge, prepare what remedies they can. But medieval medicine has little to offer against the plague. Treatments range from ineffective to actively harmful. Bloodletting, a common medical practice of the time, likely weakened patients who were already fighting a serious infection. Herbal remedies might have provided some comfort, but couldn't kill the bacteria causing the disease. Poultices applied to buboes sometimes helped them rupture, which could actually be beneficial, but the process was agonizing and still rarely led to recovery. Some plague doctors, though this specialized role won't be fully developed until later outbreaks, recommend aromatic herbs and spices to purify the air. People carry posies of flowers or pomanders of herbs, thinking they'll ward off the miasma of disease. Others turn to more extreme measures. Flagellants travel from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance, believing that by punishing themselves they might appease God's wrath. You feel a deepening sense of dread as more people fall ill. Your neighbour's child first, then the baker, then 3 members of the same family living near the church. The symptoms are unmistakable and horrifying. The healthy do what they can for the sick, but fear of contagion is strong and many sufferers are left to face their final hours alone. Those who do care for the ill try various folk remedies. Some bathe the sick in vinegar or rosewater, believing it will cool the fever and purify the body. Others, following the medical theories of the day, create poultices of herbs, bread, or even more bizarre ingredients like dried toad or arsenic. Some lance the buboes and drain the pus, which is excruciating for the patient and dangerous for the caregiver, as the material is highly contagious. You watch from a distance as the town sexton and his assistants dig graves. At first individual ones, but as the number of dead increases, they switch to mass burials. The church bell tolls so often it becomes a constant backdrop to daily life, until there are too many dead to announce individually, and the bell falls silent. The smell of death joins the already pungent odours of medieval life. Bodies awaiting burial are wrapped in whatever cloth can be spared, but there's not always time or materials to do even this properly. In some hard-hit areas, corpses are simply piled in the streets until collection carts can come around. You notice that certain groups seem to be faring better than others. The Jewish community, with its religious emphasis on cleanliness and hand-washing, has a lower infection rate, but this leads not to an adoption of their hygiene practices, but to accusations that they are somehow causing the plague, perhaps by poisoning wells. Such accusations will lead to horrific violence against Jewish communities across Europe. As days turn to weeks, the rhythm of normal life dissolves. Fields lie untended as farmers fall ill or flee. Markets are empty or sparsely attended. Church services continue, but with dwindling congregations. The tavern remains open, but the atmosphere has changed from sociable to desperate, as people drink to forget what's happening around them. You find yourself growing increasingly anxious about every physical sensation. Is that slight headache the beginning of the plague, or just the result of poor sleep? Is that ache in your armpit a swelling bubo, or just a strained muscle from yesterday's work? And always, there's the question of what to do. Stay and risk infection, flee and risk bringing the disease to wherever you go, not to mention facing the dangers of the road in medieval times. Lock yourself away and hope the plague passes you by, carry on as normal, trusting in God's will. There are no good options. Your muscles relax a bit more as you sink deeper into the bed, feeling the weight of these impossible choices our ancestors faced. The dim light of medieval dawn slowly fading as you shift positions, finding that perfect spot as your breathing slows naturally while the plague spreads through the narrow streets where you live become even more perilous. It's been a few weeks since the plague first appeared in your town, and now it's everywhere. The morning fog hangs low, making the world seem smaller, more closed in. You can barely see the end of your street through the mist. And maybe that's a blessing. Fewer bodies to count. People are trying everything they can think of to avoid getting sick. The wealthier folks have fled to country estates, hoping distance will save them. Spoiler alert, it usually doesn't. The plague follows the fleeing nobles along trade routes and roads like a shadow you can't outrun. You've noticed that nobody smells bad anymore, or more accurately, everyone smells bad so you don't notice it. But there's a new smell in town: vinegar. Lots and lots of vinegar. People are washing with it, gargling it, soaking cloths in it to wear over their faces. The sharp, acidic scent burns your nostrils, but it's better than the alternative, the sickly sweet smell of death that seeps from houses marked with a red cross. Speaking of washing, remember those public bathhouses I mentioned? They're closed now. Word has spread that bathing opens the pores and makes you more vulnerable to disease. Physicians warn against the dangers of water touching the skin, especially warm water. And when you see that most of the bathhouse workers were among the first to die, well, it's hard to argue with that kind of evidence. So bathing becomes something people avoid. The rich might still wash with rose water or vinegar-soaked cloths. The poor make do with even less. A quick wipe of the face and hands with a damp cloth is about all the cleaning most people are doing now. Full-body immersion in water? Forget about it. Too dangerous. Not that anyone's paying much attention to how others smell. When you're surrounded by death, body odor seems like a trivial concern. What people are concerned about is the air itself. The miasma theory, the idea that disease spreads through bad air, has taken firm hold. It's not entirely wrong. The plague actually can spread through the air in its pneumonic form, though no one understands the mechanism yet. But the methods people use to protect themselves are creative. Sweet-smelling herbs and flowers are in high demand. People carry nosegays, small bouquets to hold to their noses when walking through the streets. Wealthier citizens wear pomanders, perforated balls filled with ambergris, herbs and spices hanging from chains around their necks or belts. The intense fragrances are believed to purify the air before it enters the lungs. Some take it further, burning aromatic woods and herbs in their homes or in the streets, creating a haze of fragrant smoke that mingles with the ever-present fog. Juniper, rosemary, thyme, wormwood, anything that smells strong and clean is tossed onto fires. And then there are the more extreme measures. Some people believe that strong smells of any kind will drive away the plague, leading to some truly foul options. One remedy involves standing over an open latrine, breathing deeply of the noxious fumes. Others recommend holding a handkerchief soaked in urine over the nose and mouth. Yes, you heard that right. People are deliberately smelling shit and piss to avoid getting sick, and in a world where no one understands germ theory, it doesn't seem any crazier than anything else. Speaking of urine, it's not just for smelling. Some believe it has medicinal properties. Bathing in urine, usually your own, is recommended as a preventative measure. Others suggest drinking it. Medieval medicine is a wild ride, folks. But what about the actual disease-carrying culprits? The rats and fleas that are the real vectors of bubonic plague are everywhere, completely unchecked. Rats scurry through homes, granaries, streets and sewers, carrying infected fleas that jump to human hosts. No one makes the connection. How could they? The idea that a tiny insect bite could cause such devastating illness is beyond the medical understanding of the time. Instead, as the death toll rises, people look for other explanations, and too often they find scapegoats. The Jewish communities, with their religious emphasis on cleanliness and hand-washing, tend to have lower infection rates. This should be a clue that hygiene matters, but instead it leads to horrific accusations. Christians claim that Jews are poisoning wells to spread the plague deliberately. This conspiracy theory spreads almost as fast as the disease itself, leading to massacres across Europe. In some cities, Jewish people are rounded up and burned alive. In others, they're given the choice to convert to Christianity or face execution. Some communities are entirely wiped out, not by the plague, but by their neighbours. The Pope himself speaks out against these persecutions, pointing out that Jews are dying from the plague too, but fear and ignorance are powerful forces. Other marginalized groups face similar persecution. Lepers, already isolated from society, are accused of spreading disease. So are foreigners, travelers, and basically anyone who seems different. Cats, believed to be associated with the devil, are killed in large numbers, which ironically probably helps the rat population thrive, spreading more plague. Meanwhile, those tasked with healing the sick are fighting a losing battle. University-trained physicians are rare and expensive, mostly serving nobility. The common people rely on a mix of practitioners, barber surgeons, apothecaries, herbalists, midwives, and empirics. Healers, who learn through experience rather than formal education. These healers do what they can, working with the medical knowledge available, which is based largely on the theory of the four humours. According to this theory, the body contains four fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which must be kept in balance for good health. Illness occurs when these humours are out of balance. Treatment, therefore, focuses on restoring balance. For the plague, this often means bloodletting, cutting a vein to drain excess blood from the body. Leeches might be applied for the same purpose. Purgatives and emetics are administered to expel bad humours through vomiting and defecation. None of this helps, of course. In fact, bloodletting probably weakens patients who are already fighting a serious infection. But in the absence of understanding about bacteria and infection, it's the best medical science has to offer. Some healers take a more herbal approach, creating complex mixtures of plants, minerals, and animal products. Theriac, a compound containing dozens of ingredients including opium and sometimes ground-up viper flesh, is a popular but expensive remedy. More common are poultices of herbs applied directly to buboes, or teas and tinctures to be consumed. Religious remedies are just as common as medical ones. People pray, make offerings, and participate in processions to beseech God for mercy. Some towns organize massive religious demonstrations, hoping collective piety will stem the tide of death. The most extreme example are the flagellants, groups of religious zealots who travel from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance. They believe that by punishing themselves they might appease God's wrath and end the plague. Crowds gather to watch these grim processions, both horrified and hopeful. But no amount of bloodletting, herbal remedies, or self-flagellation seems to make a difference. The plague continues its deadly march through communities, killing indiscriminately. As the crisis deepens, a specialized role emerges in some areas. The plague doctor, though the iconic beaked mask won't become standard until later outbreaks, physicians who specifically treat plague victims begin to adopt protective clothing. They wear long waxed cloaks, gloves, and head coverings, trying to minimize skin exposure. Some carry wands or sticks to examine patients without touching them. These early plague doctors also use herbs and aromatics to protect themselves. Following the miasma theory, they stuff herbs into masks or hold pomanders near their faces when treating the sick. Some even smoke tobacco, recently introduced to Europe, believing the smoke will purify the air they breathe. Their treatments are limited and largely ineffective. They lance buboes to drain the infected pus, apply various poultices and herbal preparations, administer purges and emetics, and perform bloodletting. They keep meticulous records of symptoms and outcomes, trying to make sense of the disease, but without understanding its true cause, they make little progress. For most victims, the presence of a plague doctor is less about hope for recovery and more about preparing for death. These physicians often serve as witnesses for hastily drafted wills and provide what comfort they can to the dying. The dead present their own problems. In normal times, burial is a religious affair with established rituals. Bodies are washed, dressed in clean clothes, and laid out for a period of watching before burial in consecrated ground, usually the churchyard. Prayers are said, bells are rung, and the community gathers to mourn. But these aren't normal times. There are too many dead for traditional burials. Church bells that initially tolled for each death eventually fall silent. There are simply too many to announce. Gravediggers can't keep up with the demand for their services. Coffins run out, then shrouds, until bodies are simply wrapped in whatever cloth can be spared or dumped directly into mass graves. In the hardest-hit areas, collection carts move through the streets, accompanied by calls of "Bring out your dead." Bodies are piled onto these carts and transported to mass burial pits outside town walls. Sometimes the collectors are criminals, forced into this grim work in exchange for pardons or payment. Sometimes they're desperate people who have lost everything and need the money. The burial pits themselves are nightmarish, huge trenches filled with layer upon layer of corpses, covered with quicklime to speed decomposition and reduce odour. When one pit is filled, another is dug. In some places, the dead are so numerous that they're simply left where they fall, or piled in empty houses that are then burned. The normal rituals that help people process grief are largely abandoned. There's no time for proper mourning when death is everywhere. Survivors become numb to loss, focusing on immediate survival rather than emotional processing. And survival becomes increasingly challenging as the social fabric unravels. Fields lie untended as farmers die or flee. Food becomes scarce in some areas. Markets close or operate sporadically. Essential services break down as those who provide them succumb to the disease. In some towns, governance collapses entirely. Officials die or abandon their posts, leaving no one to maintain order. In others, emergency powers are granted to crisis committees, who implement increasingly strict measures to contain the plague. Quarantines, travel restrictions, bans on public gatherings. Quarantine emerges as a key strategy in port cities, where ships are required to remain isolated offshore for a period, usually 40 days, the origin of the term quarantine from quarantagiorni in Italian, before crew or cargo can come ashore. On land, infected households are often locked in their homes, sometimes with guards posted to ensure compliance. These measures are harsh, but not entirely misguided. Although people don't understand the actual mechanism of disease transmission, they observe that limiting contact with the sick seems to reduce spread. Social distancing, in a primitive form, becomes common practice. For you, daily life has become almost unrecognizable. The rhythms and routines that once structured your days have been disrupted or abandoned. Simple activities, going to market, attending church, visiting neighbors, now carry the risk of exposure to deadly disease. Hygiene practices have changed dramatically. Before the plague, you might have visited the public bathhouse weekly or monthly, depending on your status and resources. Now, those bathhouses are closed, seen as dangerous breeding grounds for disease. Instead, you clean yourself with vinegar-soaked cloths, believing the strong smell will protect you from miasma. You carry a pomander of aromatic herbs when you must venture outside, holding it to your nose in crowded areas or when passing houses marked with the red cross of plague. Your home, once merely dirty by modern standards, is now regularly fumigated with smoke from burning juniper branches or rosemary. The pungent smell makes your eyes water but seems a small price to pay for potential protection. Food and water are sources of anxiety. Some believe the plague can be transmitted through contaminated food, leading to elaborate preparation rituals. Bread is carefully examined for signs of spoilage that might indicate poisoning. Water from public wells is viewed with suspicion, especially after rumors of deliberate contamination spread. Many people turn to alcohol instead of water, drinking ale, beer, or wine with most meals. The brewing and fermentation processes make these beverages safer than potentially contaminated water, though no one understands the science behind this yet. They just know that people who drink alcohol seem to get sick less often than those who drink primarily water. Your clothing receives less attention than before. Washing clothes is a labor-intensive process involving heating water, scrubbing with lye, a harsh soap made from ashes and fat, and hanging to dry. With so many other concerns, laundry becomes less frequent. Better to wear dirty clothes than risk the supposed dangers of water contact. Plus, some believe that changing clothes too often might make you more vulnerable to disease. The layer of dirt and oils on well-worn garments is seen as a potential barrier against harmful miasma. This theory, like so many others, has no basis in reality but becomes accepted wisdom in a time of desperate fear. Sleep is difficult. The constant anxiety, the sounds of suffering from nearby houses, the uncertainty of whether you'll wake in the morning or develop symptoms during the night, all conspire to make rest elusive. Many report vivid nightmares when they do sleep, their subconscious processing the horrors of daily life. Despite all these precautions and changes to daily life, the plague continues its deadly work. Neighbors, friends, family members fall ill and die, often within days of showing symptoms. The lucky few who recover are left weakened, sometimes with permanent physical reminders like scars from burst buboes. You've heard stories of entire villages wiped out, of cities where half the population has died, of regions where the living can barely keep up with burying the dead. Some say the end of the world has come, that this is God's final judgment on a sinful humanity. Others look for earthly explanations: poisoned wells, unfavorable planetary alignments, miasma from decomposing bodies. No one suspects the actual culprits, the rats that scurry through streets and homes carrying fleas infected with Yersinia pestis bacteria. These tiny insects jump from rats to humans, delivering the deadly bacterium through their bites. In some cases, the infection spreads to the lungs, allowing direct transmission from person to person through coughing and sneezing. This complex chain of transmission won't be understood for centuries. In the meantime, people do what they can with the knowledge they have, implementing hygiene and protection measures that range from moderately helpful to actively harmful to completely irrelevant. And through it all, life somehow continues. People still work when they can, still eat and drink, still find moments of connection and even joy amidst the horror. The human spirit proves remarkably resilient, even in the face of catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale. As another day ends, you return to your home, carefully washing your hands and face with vinegar water before eating a simple meal. The smell of burning rosemary fills the small space, mingling with the aroma of cooking food. Through the thin walls, you can hear your neighbor coughing. You try not to think about what that might mean. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, more death, more fear, more desperate measures against an enemy no one truly understands. But for now, there's food, shelter, and the fact that, at least for today, you've survived. Your breathing slows a bit, the weight of medieval existence heavy on your chest but somehow not crushing. The tension in your shoulders releases slightly as you imagine those vinegar-soaked cloths, the sting in your nostrils almost comforting in its harshness. You shift positions, settling deeper into your modern bed as the medieval town around you grows quiet, except for the occasional sound of the death cart's wheels on cobblestones as it makes its rounds, collecting the day's victims. While the death cart makes its grim rounds through the narrow streets, some people are surviving. Not many, but some. And the question everyone's asking is, why them? Why do some people catch the plague and die within days, while others living in the same house remain healthy? Nobody has the right answer, of course. They won't for centuries, but they have plenty of theories, and these theories shape how people approach hygiene and health during this nightmare. Some believe it's purely divine selection, God choosing who lives and who dies based on spiritual merit. Others think it has to do with the alignment of stars and planets at the time of your birth, or your particular balance of the four humours, and some notice patterns that are actually useful even if they don't understand why. One thing people start to realise, the wealthy seem to be dying at lower rates than the poor. This isn't universal. Plenty of nobles and rich merchants succumb to the Black Death, but overall, if you're well off, your chances are better. What they don't understand is why. We know now that it's partly because the wealthy have better nutrition, larger homes with less crowding, the ability to flee infected areas, and access to better medical care, though better is relative in the 14th century. But they also have certain hygiene advantages that actually matter. The wealthy can afford to change their clothes and bedding more often. They can pay servants to keep their homes cleaner, removing waste and food scraps that might attract rats. They have private wells or water sources less likely to be contaminated. And importantly, they interact with fewer people day to day, limiting their exposure to the pneumonic form of plague that passes directly from person to person. Some communities fare better than others too. Jewish neighborhoods, with their religious practices emphasizing hand-washing and cleanliness, see lower infection rates in many cities. But as we discussed earlier, this leads to persecution rather than imitation of their hygiene practices. Monasteries and convents, despite their communal living arrangements, sometimes have lower mortality rates as well. Many follow strict hygiene regimens as part of their daily routines: regular washing of hands before meals and after certain tasks, clean clothing and orderly waste disposal. Plus, they're often physically isolated from the general population, limiting exposure. As the plague continues its devastating march across Europe, a specialised profession begins to emerge more formally: the plague doctor. We touched on this earlier, but let's look more closely at these medieval frontline workers and their approaches to personal protection. The most famous image of a plague doctor, the beaked mask and head-to-toe leather or waxed canvas covering, actually doesn't become standardized until later outbreaks. During the initial wave of the Black Death, physicians adopt various protective measures based on the miasma theory, but there's no uniform plague doctor costume yet. They do share certain practices, though. Most cover their clothing with waxed leather or canvas overcoats, believing these materials resist the miasma better than ordinary cloth. They wear gloves, sometimes multiple pairs. They carry staffs or canes, not just as walking aids, but to examine patients without touching them directly. And they use aromatics, pomanders, nosegays, or herbs stuffed into masks or held near the face to purify the air they breathe. The herbs and spices used for this purpose vary widely, but commonly include juniper, rosemary, mint, sage, wormwood, camphor, cloves, and myrrh. The wealthy use exotic imports like ambergris and civet. These strong-smelling substances don't kill plague bacteria, but the masks themselves provide some barrier protection against flea bites and, in the case of pneumonic plague, respiratory droplets. The duties of plague doctors extend beyond treatment. They're also responsible for examining suspected cases, ordering quarantines, supervising burials, and keeping records of deaths. In some cities, they're required to mark infected houses with a cross or other symbol, warning others to stay away. Their actual medical treatments reflect the limited understanding of the time. They lance buboes to drain pus, apply herbal poultices to affected areas, prescribe complex medicines based on the theory of humours, and perform bloodletting. None of these interventions addresses the bacterial infection itself, but lancing buboes might occasionally help by reducing the bacterial load in the body. For most plague victims, the prognosis is grim. Estimates of mortality rates for untreated bubonic plague range from 60–90%, and for pneumonic and septicemic forms, it's nearly 100%. Recovery, when it happens, is slow and often incomplete, with survivors left weakened and sometimes disfigured by scars from burst buboes. But not everyone who's exposed gets sick. We now know that about 15% of the population has a genetic mutation that provides some resistance to the plague bacteria. These individuals might become infected but fight off the disease before developing serious symptoms. To medieval observers, these people seem blessed or protected by some mysterious force. Others avoid infection through what we'd now call good hygiene practices, though they don't understand the science behind why these practices help. Frequent hand washing, changing and cleaning clothes regularly, keeping living spaces free of waste and food scraps that attract rats, all reduce the risk of exposure to infected fleas. Some towns and cities implement public health measures that actually help, even without understanding the true mechanism of disease transmission. Quarantines for incoming travellers and ships, isolation of infected households, and burial of the dead in deep pits outside city walls all reduce opportunities for the disease to spread. Venice, one of the busiest ports in medieval Europe, develops one of the most sophisticated systems. Ships arriving at the Venetian lagoon are required to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone can disembark. Goods from these ships are unloaded onto platforms and exposed to the elements, in the belief that fresh air will disperse any miasma clinging to them. The Venetians also establish a dedicated island, Lazaretto Vecchio, as a plague hospital, where the infected are taken to isolate them from the general population. While the primary intent is to protect the healthy, this isolation inadvertently reduces opportunities for the pneumonic form of plague to spread from person to person. Milan takes a different but equally effective approach. When plague reaches the city, officials immediately seal infected houses, bricking up doors and windows with the inhabitants still inside. Those inside are essentially condemned to death, but the ruthless policy significantly reduces Milan's overall mortality compared to other major cities. These public health measures, brutal as they sometimes are, represent early attempts at evidence-based medicine. Officials observe what seems to work and implement policies based on those observations, even without understanding why they work. But for every effective measure, there are dozens of useless or harmful practices. People hang dead toads around their necks, believing they'll absorb the poison of plague. They drink potions containing mercury or arsenic, causing heavy metal poisoning on top of whatever else they're suffering from. They sit in sewers breathing the fumes, apply dung poultices to buboes, and consume mixtures of powdered unicorn horn, usually ground narwhal tusk. The chaos and desperation of the plague years disrupts normal hygiene practices, sometimes for the better, but often for the worse. Public bathhouses close, either by official order or because people fear them as sources of contagion. This leads to less frequent bathing for most of the population. At the same time, other cleaning practices intensify. People wash their hands more often, especially after handling potentially contaminated objects or being in public places. They clean their homes more thoroughly, using vinegar, lye, and fumigation with aromatic smoke. They isolate or discard objects belonging to the infected, intuitively practicing a form of contamination control. Clothing presents a particular challenge. The wool, linen, and occasionally cotton garments of medieval Europe are difficult to clean thoroughly without modern detergents and washing machines. Laundering requires heating water, no small task without modern conveniences. Scrubbing with lye soap or urine, which contains ammonia. Rinsing and then drying, a process that might take days. During the plague, people become even more reluctant to wash clothing frequently because of the belief that water, especially warm water, opens the pores and makes the body more vulnerable to miasma. Instead, they air clothes out, expose them to smoke from aromatic fires, or dust them with powders made from dried herbs. The wealthy might change clothes frequently, having servants fumigate worn garments before storing them away. The poor wear the same clothes for extended periods, perhaps wiping visible dirt away, but rarely performing full laundering. This reluctance to wash clothes and bodies, combined with the general disruption of society, leads to an increase in parasitic infections like lice and scabies. These conditions cause intense itching, leading to scratching that breaks the skin and creates opportunities for secondary bacterial infections. Food hygiene suffers as well. With reduced labour forces due to death and flight, food production and distribution systems break down. In some areas, people are forced to eat whatever they can find, with little attention to freshness or proper preparation. Contaminated food leads to gastrointestinal illnesses that further weaken plague-ravaged populations. Water sources become objects of suspicion. Wells are accused of being poisoned, leading some to avoid drinking water altogether in favour of ale, wine, or other fermented beverages. The alcohol content of these drinks actually does provide some protection against waterborne pathogens, though no one understands this yet. Some cities attempt to maintain water purity by passing ordinances against dumping waste in rivers or near wells, but enforcement is difficult in the chaos of the plague years. Venice, with its unique system of cisterns for collecting and filtering rainwater, maintains relatively clean drinking water, which may contribute to its eventual recovery. As months stretch into years, the initial wave of the Black Death begins to wane, not because of any human intervention, but due to a combination of factors: a reduction in the susceptible population through death and acquired immunity, seasonal changes affecting flea activity, and possibly mutations in the plague bacterium itself. In its wake, it leaves a transformed society. The massive depopulation, with estimates ranging from 30% to 60% of Europe's people dead, creates labour shortages that increase the value of surviving workers. Peasants and urban labourers can demand better wages and conditions, accelerating the breakdown of the feudal system. The plague also changes attitudes toward hygiene and public health. The observed correlation between filth and disease leads some cities to implement new sanitation measures. Streets are cleaned more regularly, waste disposal is better regulated, and water sources are protected. Yet paradoxically, personal cleanliness in some ways declines. The association of bathing with plague transmission, reinforced by the closure of public bathhouses, leads to less frequent full-body washing. This trend will continue for centuries, reaching its nadir in the 16th-18th centuries when infrequent bathing becomes fashionable among European elites. Instead of water bathing, dry cleaning methods become more common. People change their linen undergarments regularly, believing that the linen will draw impurities out of the body through the skin. They use perfumes and powders to mask body odor rather than washing it away. They practice spot cleaning of visible dirt rather than full immersion. Another significant change is in clothing. Pre-plague fashion had favoured tight-fitting garments that showcased the body. Post-plague, looser clothing that completely covers the body becomes prevalent. This shift is partly due to changing aesthetics, but also reflects a desire to protect the skin from exposure to miasma. For the survivors, there's a grim silver lining to the catastrophe. With fewer people competing for resources, those who live through the plague often enjoy improved nutrition and living conditions. Archaeological evidence shows that people who survived the Black Death and lived into the late 14th and 15th centuries were often healthier, taller, and longer lived than their pre-plague ancestors. The plague also accelerates certain technological and cultural developments. With labour now scarce and valuable, there's greater incentive to develop labour-saving devices and techniques. The traumatic collective experience of the pandemic influences art, literature, and philosophy, contributing to the early stirrings of the Renaissance. But these changes come at an almost unimaginable cost. Entire villages wiped out, families destroyed, knowledge and skills lost with the death of those who practiced them. The psychological trauma of surviving when so many others didn't. The rupture in the fabric of medieval society. And perhaps most significantly for our story, a profound shift in how people think about disease, cleanliness, and the human body. The plague creates associations between bathing and illness that will persist for centuries, leading to the notoriously infrequent bathing habits of early modern Europeans. It also establishes a template for responding to epidemic disease that will be followed with variations during subsequent outbreaks: quarantine of the sick, restriction of movement, fumigation of spaces and objects, use of protective clothing and aromatics by healers, and social distancing, though they wouldn't have used that term. Some of these measures help, some don't, and some actively harm, but all of them shape the evolution of hygiene practices in the centuries to come. As the immediate crisis of the Black Death recedes, life gradually returns to a new normal. Fields are cultivated again, though there are fewer hands to work them. Markets reopen, with higher prices reflecting the reduced workforce. Churches hold services for diminished congregations. The rhythms of medieval life resume, altered but persistent. For you, our time traveller in this medieval world, daily hygiene routines adjust to the post-plague reality. You wash your hands and face with vinegar water, having abandoned full immersion bathing. You change your linen undergarments when you can, believing they draw impurities from your body. You carry a pomander of sweet-smelling herbs when venturing into crowded places, still wary of miasma, even as the plague fades. Your home, once filled with family members, might now be half empty, with gaps at the table where loved ones once sat. Or perhaps you've moved, taking advantage of the properties left vacant by the dead, seeking a fresh start away from painful memories. The smell of vinegar and aromatic herbs has become as familiar as the background odours of medieval life. Smoke from cooking fires, animals and their waste, unwashed bodies, tanned leather, fermentation. These smells no longer register consciously, they're just the scent of the world you inhabit. The terror of the plague years gradually subsides, replaced by a wary acceptance that death can come suddenly and inexplicably. This acceptance shapes attitudes toward hygiene, health, and mortality for generations to come. Your muscles relax a bit more as you imagine how it must have felt to survive such devastating times, your breathing naturally finding a slower rhythm. You shift positions slightly, sinking deeper into your comfortable bed far from the straw pallets of medieval Europe. A gentle heaviness settles in your limbs as you continue watching this distant world where the stench of death has slowly been replaced by the more familiar smells of everyday medieval life. The plague didn't vanish overnight. It retreated gradually, with sporadic outbreaks continuing for years. But eventually, the catastrophic mortality of those first terrible years subsided. Now, a few years after the initial wave, people are adapting to their new reality. Towns have fewer inhabitants, fields have fewer workers, churches have fewer parishioners. The survivors have inherited a changed world. Let's look more closely at how hygiene practices evolved in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death as people tried to make sense of what had happened and protect themselves from future outbreaks. One of the most significant changes was the further entrenchment of the miasma theory of disease. The idea that illness spread through foul air had existed before the plague, but the pandemic seemingly confirmed it. People observed that those near the sick often got sick themselves, which they attributed to breathing the same corrupted air. This led to an intensified focus on air quality and smell. Towns and cities passed ordinances against activities that produced foul odours, tanning leather, butchering animals, emptying cesspits, requiring these to be done outside city walls or in designated areas. Venice, always at the forefront of public health measures, created a permanent health magistracy in 1348 tasked with maintaining the city's cleanliness and monitoring potential disease outbreaks. They enforced regulations on waste disposal, street cleaning, and the inspection of goods entering the city. Other Italian cities followed suit, establishing what historians now recognize as the first boards of health in Europe. These institutions developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to disease prevention, focusing on sanitation, quarantine, and the isolation of the sick. The emphasis on clean air also influenced personal hygiene practices. People continued to use aromatics, pomanders, nosegays, and censers of burning incense to purify the air in their homes and around their bodies. The wealthy might change their clothes frequently, fumigating worn garments with aromatic smoke before storing them away. But actual bathing with water remained suspect. The theory that warm water opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to miasma had become firmly established during the plague years. This belief would persist for centuries, contributing to the notoriously infrequent bathing habits of early modern Europeans. Instead of full-body immersion, people practiced what we might call spot cleaning, washing hands, face, and occasionally other body parts with cloth dampened with water, vinegar, or rose water. They changed linen undergarments regularly, believing these absorbed impurities from the body. The linen shirt or chemise worn beneath other clothing became an important element of personal hygiene. Clean linen against the skin was considered essential for health, drawing out sweat and oils that might otherwise harbour disease. The visible portions of these undergarments, at the neck and wrists, were a social signal of cleanliness and status. For the wealthy, personal grooming focused on appearances rather than cleanliness in the modern sense. They might use powders and perfumes to mask body odour, combs and brushes to keep hair neat, and various preparations to maintain the complexion. Teeth were cleaned with cloths, herbal preparations, or small brushes, though dental hygiene as we understand it was limited. The poor, as always, had fewer options. They might wash in rivers or streams when weather permitted, though less frequently than before the plague due to new fears about water and disease. They had fewer changes of clothing and less access to luxuries like perfumes or cosmetics. But they still attempted to maintain basic cleanliness, particularly of the hands and face. Communal bathing, once a regular part of medieval life, declined significantly after the Black Death. Many public bathhouses had closed during the plague and never reopened. Those that did often gained reputations as places of prostitution and vice rather than cleanliness. This shift in bathing habits was not universal across Europe. In regions with strong bathing traditions, such as Scandinavia with its saunas or parts of Eastern Europe influenced by Turkish baths, people continued to practice regular full-body washing. But in Western Europe, the decline in bathing was dramatic and long-lasting. The plague also influenced waste management in medieval communities. Before the Black Death, waste disposal was haphazard at best. Human and animal waste, food scraps and other refuse might be thrown into streets, dumped in nearby rivers, or collected in cesspits that were irregularly emptied. After experiencing the devastating mortality of the plague, some cities implemented stricter regulations on waste disposal. Streets were to be cleaned regularly, waste was to be removed to designated areas outside city walls, and water sources were to be protected from contamination. In practice, these regulations were often poorly enforced or followed, but the principle had been established that public sanitation was a matter for authorities to regulate, laying groundwork for later public health developments. Water sources received particular attention, wells were covered and monitored, and activities that might contaminate water, like tanning, dyeing, or butchering, were prohibited near public water supplies. In some cities, professional water carriers delivered water from relatively clean sources to households for a fee. Food hygiene also evolved in response to the plague experience. Authorities became more vigilant about the quality of food sold in markets, particularly meat and fish that spoiled quickly. Regulations governed when and where certain foods could be sold, and inspectors might confiscate items deemed unwholesome. At home, people paid more attention to food preparation and storage. They cooked food thoroughly, believing heat destroyed disease-causing miasma. They used herbs and spices liberally, not just for flavor, but for their supposed medicinal properties. Garlic, onions, and strong herbs, like rosemary, were valued for their purifying qualities. Alcoholic beverages remained safer than water due to the sterilizing effects of fermentation, though the science behind this wasn't understood. Wine, ale, and beer were staples of the medieval diet, consumed by all ages and social classes, though in different qualities and quantities. The plague also changed how people thought about animals, particularly those associated with filth and disease. Rats weren't yet recognized as plague vectors, but they were viewed with increased suspicion and disgust after the pandemic. Efforts to control rat populations intensified in some areas, though usually not enough to significantly impact plague transmission. Cats, ironically, might have helped control rat populations and thus reduce plague spread, but cats had been demonized before the Black Death, associated with witchcraft and the devil. During and after the plague, this association strengthened in some regions, leading to periodic massacres of cats that probably made the rat problem worse. Dogs fared somewhat better, being valued for hunting, herding, and protection, but strays were often viewed as disease carriers and targeted for culling, especially during outbreaks of illness. Fleas and lice, the actual vectors of plague and typhus respectively, were constant companions for most medieval people. Regular delousing was part of personal grooming, with fine-toothed combs used to remove lice and their eggs from hair. Various herbal preparations were applied to the body, and bedding to repel fleas and other insects. These parasites were annoying but accepted as inevitable. No one yet connected them to the transmission of serious diseases. That understanding wouldn't emerge until the late 19th century, when scientists finally identified the flea-rat-human chain of bubonic plague transmission. As years passed and the immediate trauma of the Black Death receded, some hygiene practices relaxed while others became institutionalized. The intense fear that had driven people to extreme measures during the height of the pandemic gradually subsided, replaced by a more measured wariness. Public bathhouses slowly reopened in some areas, though never regaining their pre-plague popularity. People resumed more regular washing of clothing and linens. The obsessive use of aromatics to purify air became less universal, though remaining common during times of illness or suspected contagion. At the same time, public health measures that had proven effective became more formalized. Quarantine procedures for ships and travelers entering cities were codified into law. Systems for reporting and responding to disease outbreaks were established. Regulations governing waste disposal, water quality, and food safety were expanded and better enforced. These developments were most advanced in Italian city-states like Venice, Florence, and Milan, which had been among the hardest hit by the initial wave of plague and experienced repeated outbreaks in subsequent decades. Their public health innovations gradually spread to other parts of Europe, adapting to local conditions and resources. For individuals living in this post-plague world, hygiene remained a blend of practical cleanliness, medical theory, often mistaken, religious obligation, and social convention. The specific practices varied widely based on geography, social status, occupation, and personal preference. A merchant in Venice might start his day by washing hands and face with rose water, changing into a fresh linen shirt and perhaps applying a light cologne. He'd attend to business in the city's regulated markets, return home to a house regularly cleaned by servants, and perhaps visit a physician who advised on preventative health measures based on his particular humoral balance. A peasant woman in rural France might wash her hands and face with plain water from a stream, wear the same woolen dress for weeks with perhaps a clean apron for church, empty chamber pots into a designated midden heap, and rely on herbal remedies passed down through generations when illness struck her family. A monk in a Benedictine monastery would follow strict routines of hand-washing before meals and after certain tasks, wear clean robes appropriate to his order, observe communal eating with prescribed blessings and rituals, and perhaps serve in the monastery infirmary using treatments based on ancient texts supplemented by practical experience. What these diverse individuals shared was a world that had been fundamentally altered by the experience of pandemic disease. The Black Death had demonstrated humanity's vulnerability in the face of invisible, uncontrollable threats. It had killed indiscriminately across social boundaries, though sparing some while taking others for reasons no one could fully explain. This collective trauma influenced attitudes toward health, cleanliness, and mortality for generations. It accelerated existing trends in public health and sanitation while creating new fears and taboos around certain practices like communal bathing. It prompted authorities to take greater responsibility for community health, while also spreading fatalistic attitudes among populations who had seen how quickly and randomly death could come. The hygiene practices that emerged from this crucible were a mix of helpful, harmful, and neutral in terms of actual disease prevention. Increased attention to waste management and food quality probably reduced some illnesses. Decreased bathing likely had minimal impact on plague transmission, but may have worsened other conditions like skin infections. The use of aromatics provided psychological comfort without affecting bacterial spread. What's most striking to modern observers is how these practices persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed. The association between bathing and disease vulnerability, for example, influenced European hygiene habits for almost 500 years. Public health measures developed in response to the Black Death formed the foundation of systems that evolved into modern boards of health and disease control agencies. Even today, echoes of medieval plague responses can be seen in how we react to infectious disease threats. Quarantine, isolation of the sick, restriction of movement, and heightened attention to hygiene remain core strategies, though now informed by germ theory rather than miasma theory. The human experiences of fear, loss, adaptation, and resilience in the face of pandemic disease also remain remarkably consistent across the centuries. The bewilderment and terror of the initial outbreak, the desperate search for explanations and remedies, the gradual adjustment to a new normal. These patterns have repeated throughout history, most recently during the COVID-19 pandemic. For the medieval survivors of the Black Death, life continued with this new awareness of vulnerability. They washed their hands with greater frequency, avoided sources of foul odours, carried protective aromatics, monitored their communities for signs of returning plague, and passed these practices to their children, creating habits and beliefs that would shape European hygiene for centuries to come. As you lie there, feeling the weight of this history, your breathing naturally slows, the tension in your shoulders eases as you imagine those medieval hands washing with vinegar water, the sharp smell filling the air. Your body feels heavy, comfortable, sinking deeper into the softness beneath you. That feeling of gratitude for modern plumbing and medicine spreads through you like warmth as your muscles relax completely, your mind still wandering those narrow medieval streets where plague doctors once walked with their herb-filled masks and their strange beaked masks that would become infamous symbols of plague for centuries to come. Those doctors, moving like dark birds through streets emptied by death, represent one of the most fascinating responses to the plague's hygiene challenges. Let's look more closely at these plague doctors and their protective gear, which evolved from the earlier measures we discussed into something more standardized. The most iconic version of the plague doctor costume was created by a French physician named Charles de Lorme in the early 17th century during a later outbreak of plague, but its elements were developing throughout the post-Black Death period we've been exploring. The full outfit included a waxed leather or canvas coat that covered the body from neck to ankle, leather gloves, boots, a wide-brimmed hat, and the distinctive beaked mask. The coat was often treated with wax or oils to create a smoother surface that pests like fleas couldn't easily cling to. The ensemble was designed to cover every inch of skin, creating a barrier between the doctor and the outside world. But it's the mask that captures our imagination. The beak, often 6 to 8 inches long, wasn't just a bizarre fashion choice. It served a specific purpose based on the miasma theory of disease. The beak was filled with aromatic substances, dried flowers, herbs, spices, camphor or vinegar-soaked sponges. As the doctor breathed, air would pass through these materials, supposedly being purified before reaching the lungs. Common substances used in these masks included lavender, mint, camphor, cloves, myrrh, rose petals, amber, and laudanum, a tincture of opium. Some of these actually had mild antibacterial properties, though not enough to kill plague bacteria, but the mask itself, by covering the face, provided some protection against respiratory droplets that could spread pneumonic plague. The plague doctor also carried a rod or cane about 3 feet long. This served multiple purposes, examining patients without direct contact, indicating to others to maintain distance, and sometimes containing perfume or vinegar that could be sniffed as additional protection against miasma. These doctors weren't usually the elite physicians who attended nobility. Often they were lower status medical practitioners or young doctors just starting their careers. Some were essentially hired hands with minimal medical training employed by towns or cities specifically to treat plague victims when other doctors had fled. Their duties went beyond treatment. They kept records of deaths, performed rudimentary autopsies, supervised burials, and enforced quarantines. In some areas, they were required to carry special licenses and could be punished for abandoning their posts during outbreaks. The treatments they offered reflected the medical knowledge of the time: bloodletting, herbal remedies, poultices applied to buboes, and various concoctions meant to rebalance the humours. None of these effectively addressed the bacterial infection, though lancing buboes might occasionally help by draining infected material. For most patients, the arrival of the plague doctor was less about hope for recovery and more about preparing for death. These physicians often served as witnesses for hastily drafted wills and provided what comfort they could to the dying. The plague doctor became such a powerful symbol of death that the costume was eventually incorporated into Italian commedia dell'arte as a stock character and became a traditional mask in the Venetian carnival. What began as protective medical gear transformed into an enduring cultural icon representing the fear and mortality of plague times. While specialized plague doctors developed their protective equipment, ordinary people continued to adapt their hygiene practices in response to recurring outbreaks. The Black Death of 1347-1351 was just the first wave. Plague returned repeatedly over the next few centuries, though never again with the same devastating mortality. These recurring outbreaks reinforced certain hygiene practices while allowing others to gradually evolve. The fear of bathing remained strong in many areas, with full immersion in water still considered dangerous. Instead, people focused on changing their linen undergarments frequently, believing that linen drawn impurities from the body. The concept of clean had different meanings than it does today. Clean clothes meant garments free from visible soil and foul odours, not necessarily washed with soap and water. Clean bodies meant hands and faces washed regularly, with special attention to fingernails, teeth, and breath, rather than full-body washing. Perfumes, powders, and aromatics remained important tools for personal hygiene, used to mask body odors and supposedly purify the air around the individual. The wealthy might carry pomanders or scented handkerchiefs, while the poor used sachets of whatever strong-smelling herbs they could gather. Oral hygiene practices included rinsing with wine or vinegar, rubbing teeth with cloths, and using various preparations to freshen breath. Toothbrushes as we know them wouldn't become common until the late 17th century, but people cleaned their teeth with linen cloths or small bundles of herbs. Hair received considerable attention, being washed more frequently than the rest of the body. Various rinses and preparations were used to clean hair, treat scalp conditions, and enhance its appearance. Regular combing with fine-toothed combs helped control lice, a constant problem in pre-modern Europe. Barbers provided haircuts, beard trimming, and basic medical services like bloodletting and tooth extraction. Their shops were social spaces as well as service providers, places where men gathered to exchange news and gossip while waiting their turn. Women's grooming often took place at home, assisted by female family members or servants. Wealthy women might employ personal maids to help with elaborate hairstyles, cosmetics, and dress. These beauty routines could be time-consuming, but were considered essential for maintaining social status. Cosmetics were widely used by both men and women of the upper classes, though with different goals. Women sought to achieve the fashionable pale complexion through white lead or arsenic compounds, both highly toxic, rouge for cheeks and lips, and various preparations for enhancing eyes and brows. Men might use powders to lighten their complexion or darken their beards. The lower classes used simpler versions of these cosmetics when they could afford them, or relied on natural alternatives like beetroot juice for rouge or soot mixed with fat for darkening eyebrows. All of these grooming practices took place against the backdrop of living conditions that remained challenging by modern standards. Housing was often crowded, with multiple family members sharing sleeping spaces. Heating and cooking relied on open fires, filling homes with smoke that blackened walls and ceilings. Lighting came from candles or oil lamps that provided minimal illumination after dark. Water had to be carried from wells, springs, or rivers, making every use a labour consideration. Waste disposal remained problematic, with chamber pots emptied into cesspits or streets despite increasing regulation. Food storage was limited without refrigeration, leading to frequent spoilage and waste. Yet within these constraints, people created routines and practices that maintained a level of cleanliness they considered acceptable. They adapted to their circumstances, using the resources available to meet their needs for hygiene and grooming. What's particularly interesting is how these adaptations varied across Europe. Mediterranean regions generally maintained more frequent bathing practices than northern areas, influenced by lingering Roman traditions and contact with Islamic cultures that emphasized regular washing. Eastern Europe was influenced by Russian and Turkish bathing customs, including communal steam baths similar to modern saunas. Social class created further variations. The nobility and wealthy merchants could afford private facilities, servants to heat water and empty waste, and luxury items like imported soaps and perfumes. The urban poor shared public wells and privies, washed clothing in rivers or communal washhouses, and used whatever materials were locally available for cleaning. Rural dwellers had their own patterns, often with better access to clean water from springs or streams, but fewer specialized facilities. Farm families might bathe in the same tubs used for laundry or food preparation, with water heated over cooking fires. Religious communities maintained their own distinct practices. Monasteries and convents often had sophisticated water systems and regular hygiene routines prescribed by their rules. Islamic communities followed religious obligations for washing before prayers. Jewish communities observed ritual cleanliness requirements, including regular hand-washing and mikveh baths. These diverse approaches to hygiene existed simultaneously across medieval Europe, creating a complex tapestry of practices rather than a single uniform standard. What they shared was a fundamental understanding of cleanliness that differed from our modern germ theory-based concept. For medieval people, cleanliness was about appearances, odour, ritual purity, and balance of humours rather than elimination of microscopic organisms. They cared about being clean in ways that made sense within their understanding of health and disease, their religious beliefs, and their social contexts. Their solutions to hygiene challenges were creative and often effective within the limitations of their knowledge and resources. They used vinegar as an antibacterial agent without knowing why it worked. They developed quarantine procedures that genuinely reduced disease transmission without understanding the actual mechanisms involved. They created protective clothing that, however bizarre it might look to modern eyes, provided real barriers against flea bites and respiratory droplets. As we've explored this distant world of medieval hygiene during and after the Black Death, perhaps what's most striking is the resilience of the human spirit in the face of catastrophe. People adapted, innovated, and carried on with daily life even amid unimaginable loss. They developed new practices and institutions in response to tragedy, some of which laid groundwork for modern public health approaches. The plague years transformed not just hygiene practices but entire societies. Labour shortages caused by massive depopulation increased the value of surviving workers, accelerating the decline of feudalism. Religious authority was questioned when prayers and processions failed to stop the plague, sowing seeds for later Reformation movements. Medical theory began a slow evolution toward more empirical approaches as traditional explanations proved inadequate. And through it all, ordinary people washed their hands, combed their hair, changed their clothes, and tried to keep their living spaces clean, following practices passed down through generations and adapted to their changing understanding of health and disease. The story of hygiene during the Black Plague isn't just about what people did or didn't do to stay clean. It's about how humans respond to crisis, how we make sense of the inexplicable, and how we find ways to carry on with the fundamental routines of life even in the darkest times. As you lie there, feeling the weight of this history, your breathing naturally becomes slower, deeper. The tension in your shoulders dissolves completely. Your eyelids grow a little heavier with each breath. That's it. Just letting go now. The medieval world we've been exploring feels so distant from your comfortable bed, your clean sheets, your access to soap and running water, such simple things we take for granted. Your body feels wonderfully heavy now, sinking deeper into the mattress. Those plague doctors with their herb-filled masks fade into the shadows of history as your mind drifts towards sleep. The narrow medieval streets grow quiet. The sound of the death cart's wheels on cobblestones fades to nothing. Your breathing is slow and steady now, your chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. You can let go of thoughts about vinegar washers and linen shirts, about rats and fleas and all those medieval struggles with cleanliness. Your muscles relax completely, one by one, from your toes all the way up to your forehead. That's right, so comfortable now. The weight of your body seems to melt into the bed beneath you. Your eyelids are so heavy now, barely able to stay open. Each breath takes you deeper into that peaceful place between wakefulness and dreams. The Black Death reshaped medieval Europe, changed how people thought about hygiene and health, and left marks on society that lasted for centuries. But now, those thoughts can fade away as sleep approaches. Your mind grows quiet, your breathing steady and slow. The last image before you drift off completely might be of a medieval town at dusk, the plague years finally behind it. People returning to their lives, washing their hands in the evening light, preparing for rest after a long day. Not so different from us, really, despite the centuries between. Just people trying to stay clean, stay healthy, stay alive. And as that image fades, you let go completely, drifting off into deep, peaceful sleep, leaving the medieval world and all its challenges behind. Your body perfectly still now, your mind quiet, your breathing slow and deep. Nothing more to think about, nothing more to do but sleep. That's right, just sleep now. Deep, restful sleep.